Everyone, and welcome remotely from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is Amanda Cucci, and today's webinar is titled Collaborative Development of a Framework to Assess NPS Cultural Resources Vulnerabilities to Climate Change in the Intermountain Region. We are excited to have 4 speakers with us today from various backgrounds to talk more about the collaboration between the CRavat researchers, the National Park Service, and members of the tribe in the Intermountain Region to create a tool for assessing cultural vulnerability. Thank you for tuning in today and for our webinar series held in partnership with the National Climate Adaptation Science Center, the U.S. Geological Survey, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. We will be introducing our speakers in just a moment, but first I'd like to remind you of a few logistical details. As a disclaimer, this product is for educational purposes only. The views, opinions, or positions expressed in the webinar series are those of the guest presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or Department of the Interior. Some of the materials and images that may be protected by copyright or may have been licensed to us by a third party and are restricted in their use. Mention of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references do not imply federal endorsement. I'm now going to turn you over to Sarah LeRoy and Gregg Garfin and welcome her and him to share her slides and welcome our speakers. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Amanda. While Sarah's getting the slides going there, my name is Gregg Garfin. I'm the Consortium Director for the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, and I'm joined this afternoon by Pam Benjamin, the Climate Change Coordinator for the National Park Service Intermountain Region, Sarah LeRoy, the Science Applications and Communications Coordinator for the SWCASC, and Lauren Meyer, the Program Manager for Intermountain Region Historic Preservation Services for the National Park Service. And we'll be speaking about collaborative development of a framework to assess National Park Service cultural resources vulnerabilities to climate change in the Intermountain Region. So I'll remind, next slide, please. I'll remind those of you who may not be familiar that the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center is one of 9 regional climate adaptation science centers that are overseen by the USGS. Our mission is to develop actionable science and implementable climate adaptation solutions in partnership with natural and cultural resource managers, policymakers, Native nations, and researchers across the Southwest. And this project really hits home with our parts of our mission related to cultural resources, partnership, and actionable science. Strictly speaking, the project was a cooperative agreement between the National Park Service and the University of Arizona, and only received CASC funding during the late stages of the project. But for those of you who are aware of how boundary organizations like the CASCs work, the project would not have made certain connections and partnerships and had the impact that it's had without the CASC network and name recognition. And I'll also make an editorial comment that I think this has been a really superb example of a cooperative agreement where all the partners have been really closely involved in all aspects of the work. Next slide. Our team also included a couple of other folks from the National Park Service, Rachel Adler and Evan Oskierko-Jasnaki, and they're both cultural resources specialists. Holly Hartman, an independent consultant, led our scenario planning process. and then a range of folks from the University of Arizona with expertise in biophysical sciences, product development, and historic preservation. Next slide. And our goal was to develop a National Park Service framework to identify and address vulnerabilities of cultural resources to environmental stresses and weathering, with a focus on the Intermountain region. And as you can see from the map at the right, the Intermountain region stretches from Montana to Texas, but we're really homed in on the Four Corners states, particularly Arizona and New Mexico. And with that, I will hand it over to Lauren Meyer for further remarks.
Thanks, Gregg. And thank you all for the opportunity to be with you today. So as many of you know, the unique heritage resources preserved and protected in the national park units of the southwestern United States range from several decades to several centuries old. Many are considered to be preeminent examples of their type and time period. These structures and archaeological sites are particularly susceptible to environmental impacts because of their age, the fragility of their construction materials, and their current state of preservation. Many of them are lacking structural components or exist in landscapes that are constantly changing as a result of erosion. In the last 10 to 15 years, changing weather patterns have caused higher than normal rates of degradation to many of the significant structures and sites that we manage and protect, which has required parks to rethink their overall approach to resource assessment, monitoring, and treatment, as well as visitor access because of safety concerns. Increased temperatures and long duration drought have resulted in large, high intensity wildfires that have threatened, damaged, or destroyed cultural resources, and atypical high intensity, high capacity rain events have caused significant wall collapses, loss of architectural features, erosion of archaeological site materials, and changing drainage patterns across the landscape. As the climate continues to change and become more unpredictable throughout the region, threats to these highly valued heritage resources will increase exponentially. And standard approaches to management and preservation are becoming no longer useful or relevant. So the Vanishing Treasures Program, which is a small program within the western regions of the National Park Service with a mission to protect the degrading cultural heritage across the region that has connections to traditionally associated communities and tribes. The program has been working with others across the Park Service towards the development of frameworks and methodologies to understand and assess vulnerability of cultural resources across all types to changing conditions from as early as 2012, which is when this project was actually envisioned, even though we weren't at execution, I think, until 2016 or 17. These projects are being developed and executed through a variety of partnerships with universities and nonprofits, and alongside partners and other internal programs and offices, including the Park Service's Climate Change Response Program. Each of these projects is intended to function at a different scale, whether that be micro or ground level, so literally wall by wall evaluations, meso or the sort of park or multi-site level, or the macro, which is a multi-park or sub-regional level. So today, like Gregg said, we're going to share with you work that was initiated in partnership between the University of Arizona and the Park Service, with a focus on better understanding vulnerability, sensitivity, and significance of the historic structures and archaeological sites throughout the subregion of the Southwest. The project intent was to develop a general understanding for the physical vulnerability related to climate change for cultural heritage in the region, primarily the built environment, so structures, buildings, archaeological architecture, and to identify climate parameters that are influencing that vulnerability. With this work, we're taking a step towards prioritizing resources and actions in order to recognize and manage impacts, address or accept loss, and develop approaches to adaptation. The resource needs that influence the project development will clearly observe changing conditions, both weather conditions through the severe weather events and fires, but also resource conditions, so the small and large scale degradation and failure, and you're seeing images of that on the screen right now from Fort Union National Monument in New Mexico. Also, the lack of climate change vulnerability studies with the cultural resource focus globally, but also the lack of focus in the United States on Western issues. So there has been over the years a heavy investment in studies focused on sea level rise concerns related to cultural heritage, but that's not relevant necessarily to this region in particular to a large degree. The general challenges related to climate change and cultural resources, causality. It's a real challenge for us to understand the actual cause of degradation and whether it's climate change or maintenance issues, and the maintenance issues are inclusive of staff expertise or lack thereof, lack of capacity to have continuous programs to maintain, and lack of funding. Keeping up with maintenance needs and ensuring resources are as resilient as they could be to environmental stressors is and continues to be a challenge. Also vocabulary, when we started this project, there was no real shared vocabulary with natural resources, which for cultural resources specialists. So there really was a need for us to be working collaboratively to sort of have those conversations, right? For us to better understand the vocabulary used to talk about climate change and impacts and vulnerability, and for us to share how that vocabulary relates to cultural heritage as opposed to natural resources. And then data gaps. So cultural resource managers in the Park Service have a big issue with data collection, hierarchical sort of setups in our systems, and then being able to use that data to make evaluations of resources to on a large scale. So it creates a challenge for managers trying to understand and categorize building and resource typologies, materials, conditions, and then make connections to threats. So the project was put together again in 2012, initiated, and I think Gregg threw into the chat in December of 2018 with a number of goals. One was to engage stakeholders from across resource disciplines, agencies, organizations, and parks to create a shared understanding of climate change and impacts, both actual and potential, to cultural heritage through that interdisciplinary work. To use existing data, identify climate change hotspots and vulnerable resource types based on characteristics in the subregion, develop a systems-based approach to understanding and evaluating resource vulnerability for a subcategory of cultural resources that could be transferable across disciplines, using both visual and analytical tools. You'll see through Sarah's presentation that it's a sort of GIS-based tool that was created to do that initial evaluation and prioritization, to engage in natural resource-focused assessment and planning approaches and determine their adaptability to cultural resources, identify their strengths and their weaknesses, and then to test methodologies on the ground. I think something to note about this project in particular, as Gregg mentioned, is the level of collaboration occurring across the effort. This project has brought about a small community of practice that has enabled cross-project engagement to bring in specialists on a broad scale, and has helped us to avoid a lot of repetition and also to work through many difficult conversations on methods and approaches, and to share successes. So I'm going to pass it to Sarah. And then as we move through the presentation, if there are questions that I can answer about the Park Service side of that, I'll be happy to do that. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Lauren. Okay. So I'm going to get us started talking really about the meat of the project, as Lauren said, and I do want to emphasize the collaboration piece again that Lauren mentioned. And when I talk about project team meetings, it was really the U of A side and the Park Service side at, I think we had bi-weekly meetings for for 3 years. And so during those initial project team meetings, and which included Park Service partners, and in particular Lauren, it became clear, as Lauren mentioned, that, an online GIS-based tool for assessing vulnerability would be the most useful for managers, both park and regional. But first, we had to define vulnerability for cultural resources in the Intermountain region. And so naturally, we looked to what had already been done. And so there have been many vulnerability assessments conducted within the National Park Service or, with Park Service partners, often focused on coastal resources. These on the slide, these are just a few of the many assessments, and they were really a good starting place for us as we started to define vulnerability, exposure, and sensitivity for resources in the Intermountain region. And all of the assessments that we reviewed use different methods for defining these terms, but not all of the pieces of these assessments were relevant for vanishing treasures resources that are found in the Intermountain region. And so given, like I mentioned, that a lot of the assessments were conducted for coastal resources. And so the team decided to convene experts in person, including some of the authors of these reports, in order to discuss together how we want to define these terms for cultural resources in the Intermountain region. And so in June of 2019, we convened an in-person workshop in Santa Fe. You can see a couple of the pictures here on the slide. These were, we actually got to go to Bandelier National Monument as a part of this workshop. And there were lots of discussions of how we might define vulnerability. And this was also our first presentation and feedback session with a very early version of the web-based tool that Lauren mentioned. And so I'll just, I'm going to talk more about the tool in a little bit, but I'm going to say we call this tool CRavat, which stands for Cultural Resources Environmental Vulnerability Assessment Toolbox. And then Lauren also mentioned that out of this workshop, we developed this community of practice around conducting vulnerability assessments of cultural resources in the Park Service. And so that group, actually it met monthly for a couple of years, but it's still a good network for people in the Park Service and working in this field to really share lessons learned. And you know, as Lauren mentioned, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. And so it's good to have that network of folks. And so by December of 2019, we had a good working model of CRavat, our online tool. And so we began conducting scenario planning exercises with 2 parks in the region. And these exercises were all conducted virtually due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And they went through August of 2020. And Gregg's going to talk more about this piece of the project in a little bit. I did want to mention that also around August of 2020 is when Evan Oskierko-Jasnacki joined our team. He joined the Park Service working really closely with Lauren. And Evan was and is a very crucial piece to this project. He brings a specific set of expertise around the sensitivities of cultural resources to environmental exposures and on-the-ground assessment of vulnerability. And then in March of 2020, we held a second workshop. This one was supposed to be in person and we very quickly moved it to virtual. And this was more focused on how we would define sensitivity of cultural resources to environmental factors and how that can be incorporated into CRavat. And then our last workshop in March of 2021, this was very focused on CRavat. It was essentially focus groups trying to get at how we can improve the usability of CRavat. And so after those focus groups, we incorporated that feedback into what is now the final version of the tool. And then lastly, starting in fall of 2021, Evan began conducting field testing of CRavat at parks in the region. And this field testing is still ongoing today. And so Pam's going to speak more about that later. So now I'm going to dive into CRavat, our vulnerability assessment. And this is a QR code in the link if you'd like to check it out. And the goal of CRavat is really to aid managers in making preliminary assessments. And it's a first step in assessing vulnerability. And it's really designed to be used in conjunction with on-the-ground assessments, as Evan is doing and field testing this at various parks. And so this is the landing page for CRavat. There are lots of how-to documents, introduction, data descriptions, explanations of any assumptions that we made, and frequently asked questions. And so we really tried to anticipate any questions or help that managers may need in learning how to use the tool. That said, we're sure that we've missed something. So as you're, poking around it and you have some feedback for us, please let us know. That little green button at the bottom of the homepage can provide feedback to us. And there are 2 geospatial tools in CRavat. One provides a summary of cultural resource vulnerability at the park level, and then the other summarizes vulnerability at the regional scale. And so I'll show these in just a little bit. And so this is how we decided to define vulnerability after our lit review and after all those workshops and discussions with people working in this area. This is how we decided to define it. And so that's environmental exposure multiplied by system sensitivity, where environmental exposure is the degree to which environmental factors impact an area. And system sensitivity is the degree to which a cultural resource is impacted by a given exposure. And some of the other assessments that we looked at did incorporate adaptive capacity into their equation for vulnerability, especially when assessing natural resources. But we decided as a team, after many conversations with our Park Service partners, that we decided to not factor in adaptive capacity. And this is given that a cultural resource lacks the innate ability to adapt. There, of course, is the argument that managers can assist a resource in adapting by taking adaptive measures, but just because an adaptation action is possible, doesn't always mean that it will be implemented, as we know, due to external factors such as budget and personnel constraints. And so for these reasons, we decided not to include it. And so these are the environmental exposures that we decided to focus on and incorporate into CRavat. And again, this was after many conversations with our partners on the team from the Park Service. And so the top 4 environmental exposures you see are all future projections. And then the last 2, soil erosion and wildfire hazard potential, are present data. And all of the climate projections data is using the same data set that's used in the 4th National Climate Assessment. And that's the LOCA data set, which stands for Localized Constructed Analogs. And I believe there are descriptions of these data sets in CRavat in that data piece of the homepage. And so you can view any of these exposures in CRavat. And here's an example. This is extreme precipitation, which is the change in annual number of days with precipitation greater than 1 inch. And this is projected for 2021 to 2050. Compared to 1961 to 1990. And so this isn't necessarily meant to be read pixel by pixel, but it really can give a general sense of changes in the future. So for example, for Wupatki National Monument, which is right here up near the Flagstaff, Arizona area, Wupatki will likely see moderate to high changes in the future, or a 2 to 4% increase in the number of days with precipitation greater than 1 inch. Now for system sensitivity, this is the piece that really took us a long time to hone in on, and I would even say it took us maybe years, and it looked very different over the course of the project. We would try out one method, it wouldn't work, so we'd try something else, and what we finally settled on, and seems to work really well for cultural resources in the Intermountain region, is taking a building system approach. And so this, this means that we look at the building as an entire system and not just individual factors. And so this is really a novel way of defining sensitivity. We haven't seen this in any of the lit review that we've done. And Evan and Lauren really get the credit for thinking of this building systems approach. And like I said, it took us a long time to get here. And it seems to be working pretty well, and it's in CRavat now. And so there are 6 different factors that go into defining a building system, and these are circled here in red. And CRavat has this helpful little tool that can help managers find their system, and this is the finder's aid. And so in choosing a system, the manager just needs to select the option for each here that fits the system that they're looking at. And then the finder identifies the system name. And so in this case, again, we chose to look at a system present at Wapaki National Monument. So we're looking at stone 2 systems. And these are primarily made up of stone with a masonry bearing wall structure type, complex construction, good weatherability, preservation treatments are present, but there is no protective system. And so once we have our building system type selected, we can then go back into the vulnerability of systems tool in CRavat and choose to look at the vulnerability of stone 2 systems. And so for each square, you can view which exposure variables are factored into the final vulnerability score. And so for this square, excuse me, looking at Wapaki, we see soil erosion is the highest contributor in driving the vulnerability score. And then the last piece I wanted to mention, excuse me, I have a tickle, is that in CRavat, you can also use this to compare parks. So for example, compared to all parks in the Intermountain region, again, looking at stone 2 systems at Wapaki, Wapaki ranks 23 out of 88 parks. That's this piece here. And you can also compare the vulnerability of a certain system at your park to other parks in a given area in this map in the middle. And then the bottom graph in the bottom right matches whatever parks are shown in this map. And so you can compare, you can see Wapaki's kind of in the middle, Grand Canyon's the higher vulnerability of these 5 parks. And then the pie chart shows which exposure variables are factors in the calculation of the vulnerability score for the entire park. And so I think we're going to pause for questions at this point before I turn it over to Gregg, who's going to talk about scenario planning that we did with a couple of parks.
Okay, thank you, Tyler. Thank you, Sarah. So the scenario planning part of our process was aimed at developing adaptation strategies for cultural resources and exploring a repeatable process that could be used in cultural resource adaptation assessment. So we used exploratory scenario planning, a method embraced by the Park Service and codified in documents like the one shown at the left and piloted in natural resource management in the national parks. And the objective of scenario planning is to develop relevant, plausible, challenging, divergent, and compelling multiple scenarios of the future to address situations of high uncertainty. Again, the participants in this process were from National Park Service, with the aforementioned people, and participants from National Park Service units in Northern Arizona and Northern New Mexico. Next slide. We derived phases in our process from the National Park Service's Cultural Resources Climate Change Strategy. In our preparation phase, we brought our team together. We oriented everyone to the project and developed a focal question to focus the scenario planning process on. In the disruptive thinking phase, we really homed in on things that are out of the control of Park Service managers and staff, things like climate change, funding changes, public opinion, and so on, things that would have high impact and are also highly uncertain. In the empowerment phase, we developed strategies and screened them for robustness. And the practicality phase was not actually an implementation phase, but rather we connected with existing plans and workflows and disaggregated some difficult choices to see how we could work some of those out. Next slide, please. At the start, by the way, the phase is shown in a red box in the lower left-hand corner of each of the upcoming slides. In the first part of our preparation phase, just to get everybody on board with factors that affect cultural resources, we developed this influence diagram that includes climate and non-climate factors. And then next slide, we moved into the disruptive thinking phase, which is really getting into standard scenario planning. We looked at the drivers of change, some of those derived from the previous exercise. We, as is typical, lined them up along these axes of impact and uncertainty. And we really homed in on the factors that were high uncertainty and high impact. Next slide. From these, we developed multiple axes. We looked at multiple climate and non-climatic factors that we could weave together into stories that were challenging, compelling, plausible, and so on. And these included factors such as the spatial and temporal variability of climate effects, the intensity of those effects, changes to visitation, changes in relationships with tribes, support of the general public, and so on. Next slide. And we put all those together and developed 3 scenarios. The first scenario homed in on the decadal variability in climate, along with non-climate factors that include a diminished role for federal agencies and the Park Service. The second scenario homed in on changes to the extremes in climate, but not looking at extremes that were much beyond the already quite variable historic climate. And then we looked at non-climate factors that included a much less engaged Park Service, less support from leadership, the public, and tribes. And then the third scenario basically took the worst case scenario from the 4th National Climate Assessment, basically increasing aridification across the region plus increases in extremes, combined with increased funding, increased interest from Park Service leadership and within the region, and increased public support, although somewhat less engagement from tribes. And then next slide, from those we derived key management challenges. For the first scenario, how do we create opportunities in the face of multiple stressors? The second scenario, can limited capacity address relatively limited climate stresses? And in the third scenario, where there was increased interest and increased leadership and funding in the face of major climate challenges, can we think big enough? Next slide. In the empowerment phase, we then developed, we looked at implications of these strategies for management and other factors. We developed sets of strategies and rated them in terms of their difficulty. And then we further narrowed those through a so-called wind tunneling process, developed decision points and triggers, and all of that's, standard scenario planning practice. And then we further disaggregated some tasks or strategies that were considered near impossible. We disaggregated those into individual implementable steps that were synced up with management goals and objectives in official documents. And then we sequenced the sub-actions through critical path analysis, which is a tried and true engineering method. And those last two parts were innovations. Next slide. So amongst our scenarios, we looked at impacts on resources, implications for management, and then we grouped adaptation strategies in kind of big buckets like no active intervention or offset stress, improve resilience, manage change, facilitate movement, and there's an example here such as relocating staff housing. Document or prepare for loss, a sort of triage approach for cultural resources, and interpret the change, which would be really important if we were going to restrict future access to some resources and maybe even make them available only in an online documented format. Next slide. We looked for particular groups of strategies. We looked at the recommended actions that our group came up with across a grouping of strategies. And the example in this slide is no active intervention. And, for example, in this case, some of the strategies that were common across all the scenarios included updating visitor use management plans to take into account future climate that might be a whole lot drier, or build stronger bridges with tribes to understand their perspectives on possible strategies like leaving sites alone, or beefing up law enforcement because we're effectively triaging some sites. Again, this is exploratory. These are not actual Park Service strategies or policies. Next slide. We then wind tunneled down just to home in on vanishing treasure, archaeological structures and sites. We reviewed all of those strategies and winnowed down from 71 strategies to 58 strategies distributed among our portfolio categories. Next slide. We then looked at those strategies that were common to multiple combinations of scenarios, and that allowed us to define decision points and gave us a set of outputs that included the decision points and the strategies that were common for particular sets of futures. Next slide. Then we screened our strategies for robustness. The example here is this action of leaving sites alone. And we screened them to connect them with criteria to justify the use of particular sub-actions that would be necessary to implement this strategy of leaving sites alone, which is a strategy that would be considered almost impossible given current Park Service policies and regulations. Next slide. Then we broke down the sub-actions related to this hard strategy of leaving sites alone, and we looked at the dependencies among the sequence steps in implementing this very difficult action. Next. And then we ran this through critical path analysis. And just to give you a little flavor of this, if we were to implement this strategy of leaving sites alone, one of the aspects might be so-called backfilling, which might be stabilizing sites and preparing them to, in the long term, basically triage them, leave them out there. So that would require steps in a sequence that would include, for example, garnering support from tribal partners, educating people within the organization, educating the general public, entering into the NEPA process, getting a determination of adverse impact from the National Preservation Act, and then in parallel, working with research and Park Service partners to use technologies to help protect the resources in the backfilling process, and then fully document the status of the resources so that we could convey that information to the public in compelling ways, such as, let's say, online through virtual reality or something like that. Next slide. So really briefly, some of the outputs and outcomes of the process were: we documented multiple workshops in the whole process. We developed sets of adaptation strategies, including well-documented examples of following some strategies to completion. We demonstrated working through these dependencies for difficult strategies and difficult choices in a way that was integrated with existing planning documents. We produced a couple of reports for the Park Service and a public-facing brief, and we have a peer-reviewed paper in progress. And with that, I will hand it to Pam Benjamin.
Wow, thanks, Greg. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to finish off the presentation by providing a quick overview of a few ways that CRavat is being used in parks. And then I want to highlight an unplanned outcome from working with our interdisciplinary group on CRavat, and that was the development of the NPS Tribal Engagement and Climate Change Community of Practice. So just a few ways that CRavat is being used in parks right now. Lauren and her staff have been extremely busy conducting beta testing on CRavat in numerous park units to not only assess the effectiveness of the outputs from CRavat, but also to ascertain where some information gaps may be within the tool, and to start to define what some of our next steps might be to further enhance the CRavat toolbox. At Fort Union National Monument, they have specifically used a combination of CRavat output and results from a rapid condition assessment. And the park's cultural resource specialist developed a process to statistically analyze all of this data, which is helping the park to define their highest priority work needs for resources in the park. And then we've also been taking the outputs from CRavat analyses to assist us in defining climate change vulnerabilities for an upcoming planning for a changing climate workshop that will be held in February for Casa Grande Ruins National Monument. Specifically, we've been using the CRavat outputs and a lot of the information to help guide me that we did through the scenario planning process to help the park define vulnerabilities and impacts for our focal resource for the workshop, which is the main great house at the park. And we're going to be looking at these vulnerabilities and impacts under a couple different climate futures or scenarios that are specific to the park. Next slide. So quickly going on to the other topic that we wanted to highlight, and that's the NPS climate change and tribal engagement and climate change community of practice. This group has been going strong for 3 years now. The community of practice is a is a grassroots informal group focused on information exchange to enhance tribal engagement in addressing resource management issues associated with climate change. As I previously noted, development of this group was really unplanned, but it did come out of various work efforts and discussions that we were having related to the development of the CRavat toolbox. The group includes participants from across the US, not only within the National Park Service, but from several other federal agencies, from academia, as well as a number of tribal nation participants. Our calls are bi-monthly on the first Wednesday of every other month. from 10 to 11 a.m. Mountain Time, with the next call being on Wednesday, December 7th. And I have included my email in case you want more information or perhaps want to become a member of this group. Again, it's informal, it's voluntary. You attend as your schedule allows. But once I'm done speaking, I'll also drop my email into the chat for everyone. Okay, next slide. And I just want to note that this group does not have a formal charter that directs us, but we have some really great participants, and they are truly dedicated to enhancing tribal engagement through improving communications. And we do this not only amongst ourselves during our bi-monthly calls where we share information on various meetings, save the dates, and we also discuss ongoing projects that various participants are working on. But we really try to also take on activities that communicate the importance of engaging with our tribal nation partners to a broader audience. And there are a couple different ways that we try to reach this broader audience. We host an association with our partners, and I have to say several of the CASC have been incredible partners in this effort. We host the annual Native Nations and Climate Change webinar series. Typically, this is a series of 3 webinars. It's held in April, May, and June. It's been an extremely popular activity, very strongly attended, and the projects that we highlight really have served to identify the benefits of engaging with tribal nation partners in addressing climate change. And then we also have voluntary sub-working groups within this community of practice, and these working groups try to tackle issues related to barriers to engagement. And a product from one of our first year's sub-working group actually was a briefing statement that specifically tried to highlight in a way that we could find shared climate terminology between indigenous cultures and the Western science end of things. And we actually have a working group that's ongoing right now that is trying to think about writing a white paper on barriers to engagement within the Park Service. So it's been a great group. I am not a tribal engagement expert, but I have to say I have learned so much, and I really love facilitating this group. And I do have a personal philosophy that we should be working with our tribal partners as much as we possibly can. So with that, I think I am ending the presentation, but certainly I'm going to drop my name into chat and contact me if I can provide you any more information.
And I'll just note, so on this slide, we have all of our email addresses. So if you have any questions for us, just don't hesitate to reach out.
While I'm waiting, or if anyone's going to have a question, I just want to thank the National Climate Adaptation Science Center Network and all of the CASC units. I work with several of them. They have been phenomenal to work with. And I encourage everyone, if you haven't had the experience, to link into them because they're a great group of folks.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and a big thank you for our presenters today. And just one more time, this presentation will be available in a few days on the webinar gallery. So thanks again, everyone.
Thank you so much, Amanda.
Thank you.